Trevin Wax, welcome back to
Glad to be
Apollos
here.
Watered. Oh, you say that to all the podcasters.
Yeah, but I mean, it takes a little bit of courage to come back on a podcast.
Oh, okay. You're very courageous to come back.
Well, I mean, a little bit of courage. It depends on the podcast, but yeah, it's one thing to accept the first invitation. It's another thing to accept the second. So,
have you ever had a third?
I don't know. I think maybe. Yeah, I think I've been 3 times on Shane Morris's podcast, the Upstream podcast.
Okay.
Several years ago, and then the last year or so, a couple of times. So yeah.
Okay. Well, then, I mean, not that I wanted to be the first, but I appreciate the courage.
Yeah.
I guess what I should
and
say.
I'm honored to get invited back, because it's
not
always a sure thing you're going to get invited back.
Have you ever just had people go, well, that was a failure? Have you ever had that?
No, I've never had anyone tell me that. I mean, I'm sure there might have been someone who muttered that under their breath, but I've never had that actually happen in the podcast itself. So,
how many podcasts do you think you've done?
Oh goodness, wow. I mean, over the years, if I'm thinking back, like the last 10 years or so, if you put podcasts, I mean, I guess if you include radio in that too, I mean, it's got to be more than 100. I mean, maybe more than that. I don't know. That would be an interesting thing to go back on my calendar and
just try to figure that out.
I don't have time. I'm doing podcasts too much. So.
I can't chronicle the podcast.
Yeah, I can't go back and count. So.
Okay, well then let's get to the Fast Five. You know the drill. Are you ready for the Fast Five?
I'm as ready as I'm going to be. So,
all right, here we go. First question. My go-to restaurant is what?
Subway. Yes. And I get mocked for it mercilessly, but it's true. It's just, I'm one of those people that goes regularly to the same place and gets the same kind of thing, because then you don't have to make the decision. So I can save all my decision-making skills for the big things, and I can just, yeah. So my go-to is Subway. Yes.
Are you like Steve Jobs to wear the same clothes every day?
No, I'm not to that level. No.
Okay. But is it the same exact thing you get every time?
No, I usually get, I usually know when I'm going, what they have a particular meal of the day, and I like 4 out of the 5 or 6 or whatever they have. So I wind up if I go, I just generally am going to get what's on the menu for the day. So
all right.
Sometimes I'll mix it up, get a piece of bacon on there.
I have a cousin
getting really courageous, Yeah.
I have a cousin who goes to the same restaurant every single day and gets the exact same thing every single time. I just don't understand it. I don't know that. I get it though. I've heard people say, hey, let's preserve brain cells so I don't have to think about my choices. I just want to there
is something to it. There's a science to that, but at the end of the day too, it's a healthier option. So it kind of keeps me from overeating, because, restaurant portions are pretty massive these days. So yeah,
that's true. That's true. And that's surprising considering how the economy is and everything's more expensive. But anyway. All right. Next question. Number 2. One place in the world that you've never been, but you want to go to is where? The
Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. So my son has been there and I have never been there. What good parents we are that we sent our son on a trip for his senior year in high school, and he has been to Israel and we have not. But at some point I do want to go to the Holy Land. So
okay. It's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is cool. I've been, but every place you go to, it's like, we think he was here. We're not exactly sure, because they build a holy site there.
Right.
And that's the one disappointing thing. You're like, darn it, you can't fake the lake. Like, the Sea of Galilee, Lake Tiberias is what they call it. It's like,
right.
You can't fake this. This is what it is.
Yeah.
Because everywhere I went, they're like, we think it was here. We're not exactly sure. Anyway. All right. Number 3. My biggest pet peeve in my job is.
My biggest pet peeve in my job? I don't know that I would say this is in my job necessarily. It's just my biggest pet peeve over the years is that when you're given responsibility and don't have the authority to carry it out. Like it happens sometimes. I mean, even in well-oiled machine running organizations, but that's like one of the things that I struggle with. And I mean, another pet peeve is just personal. I'd much rather people be direct when there's issues than like beat around the bush. So pet peeve is like we're going to pretend like everything's great when it's not. I'm much more want to know. I've got too much work to do to not know where I stand with people or where they stand with me. And like, that's how I am with all the people I work with as well. If we've got challenges, we've got to hammer this out and work through it,
Get it on the table. Let's get it on the table. Let's get to it so we can get done with it and move on. Oh, I get that. All right. Number 4. My preferred fashion style would be called.
I mean, it's not my preferred, but I don't know, business casual.
Business casual?
Yeah, or like, I mean, I don't know. When I was a teenager, I was called a preppy because I would have like I went to a school where we had to wear collared shirts and khaki pants every day. So like whether you wanted to be or not, that's what you were. So, I mean, I'm definitely more of a jeans and t-shirt guy now, but yeah. But I don't know that I'd have a fashion. I don't know that I'd have a fashion style. And maybe that's a good thing. I almost worry about any man who too quickly answers that question with my fashion style is.
I had Alan Noble on and I asked him that question because he is into fashion. He is.
Yeah, I've seen the hats and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. He's like, what did he say? Like 40s and 50s. I don't know what classic. He didn't name it because we were trying to come up with a word for it, but he's like, that's when fashion died. Basically, after that, that's when men ceased to be men. Because he wanted.
Well, I've seen him. I like the tweed jackets and stuff. Like, that's cool. I mean, if he wants to look like C.S. Lewis, and I mean, that's totally fine.
Well, I just had a conversation with Malcolm Geit the other day, and Geit was like, I don't know if you've ever read his wiki, but it's the funniest description. It's like if Jerry Garcia. What was it? If C.S. Lewis went by way of hanging out with Jerry Garcia through San Francisco and took fashion cues from Bilbo Baggins on the way to Middle Earth on the back of a Harley. And that would be him.
That is a great description of Malcolm, actually. That's fantastic. Yeah.
I was like, and he's sitting there with a pipe and he's drinking a pint. I'm like, okay, what is going on here? Yeah. But it was fun. It was fun. And he's got a definite fashion sense. It's called
for sure.
College forgetfulness. I don't know, like professor doesn't care. I don't know what the official name is. All right, number 5. Here we go. How about this one? If you were a style of architecture, what style would you be and why?
Oh man. I mean, I don't know what style I'd be, but I definitely love classic architecture. Gothic cathedrals, soaring arches, vaulted ceilings. Like we're talking about a book in a minute called The Thrill of Orthodoxy, and I compare Orthodoxy to a castle. So you can kind of get like, that's definitely my preference as far as like just space to like feel swallowed up in and like transported. But I don't know that would be me. You know what I mean? Like if I were a style of architecture, it would probably just be like, something much, much more boring than that.
Functional. It's the khaki equivalent and a collared shirt equivalent.
Yes, exactly. It's the subway. It's Subway.
You're the second person though. And I don't ask that question all the time, but you're actually the second person to tell me Subway, but you gave a much better answer. I actually had Craig Keener on and that was his answer but he changed it because I was like, come on. And he's like, basically that's all that's in Wilmore. He's like,
oh, that's true.
There's Subway and a Chinese restaurant because that's all I have as my choices. I was like, okay, whatever. Well, let's talk about the book, Thrill of Orthodoxy. You must have been working on this last time that we hung out.
I think it was basically done by then because, they get the books done quite a bit before they come out. But but I mean, I feel like I've been working on this book for years. So it was about a year of intense writing process, but definitely has been, it's been cooking for me for, more than 5 years now.
So what was the impetus behind it?
I mean, several things. First of all, I love people that help me see Christianity afresh. So, I mean, I'm a fan of, that's one of the reasons I love G.K. Chesterton and C.S. Lewis and Dorothy Sayers and those British writers who just had a knack for turning things on their head so that you see things fresh. And so a part of me wanted to aspire to do that for another generation. to show the beauty and compelling nature of Orthodoxy. So that's been, I mean, that's something I've wanted to do for a decade or so. But just because of my inspirations. But I think more recently it's been the sense that culturally we're in this moment where there's so much going on. There's so much uncertainty, unsettledness. There's so many different cultural winds blowing. There are so many voices out there. It's just a cacophony of voices. And I feel like there's a lot of church leaders and thoughtful Christians that don't even know really what to think about everything. And especially if you take like the political situation, racial unrest, then you look at like the pandemic and whatnot, there's so many things where people just, I think there's a lot of believers that are like struggling to figure out, okay, what does faithfulness look like? And so I really have a burden in those moments where a lot seems up in the air and you don't know exactly where to land on every particular issue. And you're, going to get grilled for taking this position or that position on matters that are more of prudence or political posture and things like that, rather than actual principle theology and stuff. I just have this burden to say, well, in moments like that, we just need to go back to the basics. Go back to the bedrock of the faith, and you can with confidence plant your flag there, because Christians have been planted there for since the beginning. And if the Lord tarries 100 years from now, Christians will still be standing and confessing these same truths. So, when there's just a whole bunch of stuff where you don't know what to think, just go back to it's important, I think, for us to regain our confidence in the foundations.
So let me ask you this. How do you define orthodoxy?
Yeah, so that was a question I know I was going to have to wrestle with quickly when you write a book with orthodoxy in the title. So for the purposes of this book, I'm going back to the ecumenical consensus of the church through the ages that is summed up in the three creeds that are basically agreed upon by all Christians everywhere for the most part. So I'm thinking in particular the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, and the Athanasian Creed. These are the foundational statements about who God is and what He has done. It's the Trinitarian core of the faith. All wings of the church agree on this. So you've got, if the church is like a tree, you've got your Eastern Orthodox branch and your Roman Catholic branch, and you've got your Protestant, evangelical branches and whatnot. But this is the roots of the tree that give nutrients to the whole. So yeah, I wanted it to be a mere Christianity kind of book with a lot of evangelical emphasis in it. So I was clear about that. I was clear about that up front, because I know I've got, Catholic friends and others who are going to read the book and probably roll their eyes at some of the emphases, but for the most part, in defining orthodoxy, I think that was the best place to go, is just to say, okay, like what has been believed everywhere, always, by all, when it comes to Christians, and that was the quickest place to go.
So, there's so many questions that I have when it comes to orthodoxy. I got into I was on a cruise once on the Nile, and I was talking with this Presbyterian pastor, and he was talking about how he was a PCUSA pastor, and it was going through all this turmoil, division with LGBTQ stuff going on before the initials were all the initials. And as we were talking, this Egyptian guy comes up to us, and he goes, "Are you talking about religion?" And we said, "Sure, yeah, we're talking about it." And he said, "What religion are you?" And we said, "Well, we're Christian." He goes, "What kind?" And we said, "Well, we're evangelicals." And he's like, "What is that?" He had never ever heard of the term. So I'm like, okay, going back, I'm like, okay, the step back would be Protestant. So I'm like, okay, we're Protestants. He goes, what is that? And I was like, well, we're not Roman Catholic. And he leaned in and he goes, they were wrong from the beginning, because he was Orthodox. He was Coptic. So it was one of those things where I realized that my categories of orthodoxy and what delineates or determines the difference between me and someone else is very much focused in my own cultural milieu. Do you think that your creation of this, or your idea of defending orthodoxy, it's to those creedal groups that you said, those that are there, but do you find that in our culture today that we differ on orthodoxy within evangelicalism, on what's orthodox and what's not?
Oh,
Because there,
sure.
well, but I mean, I'm sorry, but there's one more thing I want to add to that, because today we're seeing the whole LGBTQ thing, and that wasn't addressed within the creeds. How do you go about that?
The way the creeds have been interpreted over the years is that there's a there are implicit truths that flow from the creed. So, for example, when Augustine and Pelagius had their battles over the nature of humanity, and is humanity born in sin, or is humanity born, in innocence, and things like that. Um, the debates that they had were, it wasn't, Augustine didn't say, well, these creeds don't mention the stuff that Pelagius is talking about, so I guess there's no orthodoxy here. Like and the church councils didn't look at it that way either. When they condemned Pelagius and then later semi-Pelagianism, they weren't necessarily saying, oh, this is because it's explicitly spelled out in the creeds. The creeds don't cover every area of Christianity. They cover the basic foundation and the structure, and then the confessions generally come in and fill in the details, like the blueprint of a house. I do think that implied in the creeds are some particular things, like when we talk about God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, and we talk about him being maker of it, that implies something about God's power. It implies the goodness of creation. It implies, the goodness of being made male and female.
Mhm.
So you wind up you're just, just steps away from understanding like how this actually works out into ethics. And so,
Mhm.
and this is another thing I think we got to pay attention to, even the way the Bible talks. There is a certain understanding that orthodoxy is connected to morality in a lot of ways. Like, I mean, the New Testament talks about obeying the gospel. Paul, when he's talking about the generosity of the Corinthians, it talks about obedient to their confession. So basically, proclaiming Christ as Lord implies the desire to submit and to obey the Lord's commands. So there's a sense in which you could say, yeah, orthodoxy is what we believe, but then we can all just debate about what the Christian life looks like. Well, at some level, the Christian life is going to look different from culture to culture, but I think we got to be really careful not to split the orthodoxy from ethics, because I just don't think you can do that. I mean, no one, I mean, child sacrifice is not in the creeds either. So but does that mean that we say, oh, I guess we can agree to disagree on that? No, there's certain things there's certain ethical aspects of Christianity that are taught by Jesus and the apostles that I think we've got to keep closely identified with the creeds, especially those things that have been agreed everywhere, always, by all.
So how do you then go about? I had Alan Ye on. He wrote a book called Polycentric Missiology, and we were talking about how orthodoxy is always defined when it encounters heterodoxy. And so we have this orthodoxy that we have agreed upon in the first few centuries of Christianity with these creeds. And even then, he actually got into the debate on which Nicene version of the Nicene Creed are you going to go with. Not that I'm trying I'm in agreement with you, just so you know, as I'm going into this. What I'm trying to say, and I'm trying to figure out, as we're interacting with this greater culture, orthodoxy to me gets expanded. It has to, because we're always encountering heterodoxy. How do we go about that in our very divided culture today among these issues? Do you have any thoughts? Are you going to be the evangelical pope?
There is a sense in which orthodoxy gets defined when heterodoxy or heresy shows up. But at the same time, I wouldn't want to say that orthodoxy comes as a response to heterodoxy. I think orthodoxy gets defined and clarified as a response to heterodoxy. That's a good point. The orthodoxy is already there. Mm-hmm. It's there from the very beginning. The fact that the church fathers put a lot of time and effort into the way the language, the grammar of the faith, the way that we would talk about the Trinity, for example, or what it means to confess Jesus Christ as both God and man. That's not something necessarily that is it's not something they were inventing in response to Arius and the heretics. It's something that they were seeking to clarify and unearth from the scriptures in response to those heretics. So I would say orthodoxy is already there. it's digging deeper into and coming to a fuller understanding of orthodoxy that takes place sometimes when heresies arise. So to give an example now, I think some of the heresies that are plaguing the church now tend to be not Christological first and foremost, but anthropological. That means they focus on our doctrine of humanity. What is a human being? What does it mean to be made in God's image? What does it mean to be made male and female and things like that? It's very possible that 100 years from now, Christians will have a more robust understanding of our embodiedness and what it means, what the significance and meaning of the human body and what that actually means for marriage than people 100 years ago had. Not because people 100 years ago were completely off base or they didn't understand or they didn't, but because the particular heresies and heterodoxies that are coming about what it means to be human today were not present then. So we will have it likely a fuller understanding of humanity and marriage and things like that 100 years from now than we even do now, because we're having to define and clarify the Christian understanding in response to innovations and errors that have and revisions that have recently come about.
These are such important issues as you're bringing out to you brought to the forefront. I really did appreciate how you even titled the book, The Thrill of Orthodoxy, as opposed to dry, dead orthodoxy, where people are saying that it has no idea. It has no connection to my daily
Well, people
life.
wouldn't have bought that book if I had called it dry, dead orthodoxy. I don't think it would have gotten very far.
Or you could say ordinary orthodoxy,
right? Ordinary orthodoxy. Yeah.
I mean, ordinary orthodoxy, but then I mean, even employing the term orthodoxy can't, depending on who you're talking to. I mean, the Orthodox Church could be like, oh, wonderful, he's writing a book about the Orthodox Church. Wow, this guy comes from a Southern Baptist background. Oh, or you get that, or
they will be sorely disappointed.
They would be sorely. Well,
I still hope they buy the book, though.
As you've though encountered this, how do you talk to the people? Well, let me go back. Why the thrill of orthodoxy, apart from just getting the title, getting people to buy it? How is it a thrill? Let's just drill down to the very basics. How is orthodoxy a thrill? Because most people don't think that way.
No, and most people don't think about what a thrill it is to think about the fact that a massive ball of fiery gas millions of miles away is responsible for all, is what is necessary for all human life and gives us light and warms us even from that distance. And, can either burn you or give you a nice tan, depending on how long you stay in it. People don't really think about the thrill of that, and yet where would we be without it? And so I feel like why orthodoxy is thrilling ultimately is because it's defining and describing, as much as can be described in human language, the God of the universe. It's like, staring into the sun at some level, or looking at the world in light of the sun. So the thrill is with the encounter with an actual living God, not necessarily in being able to have a checklist of all the right doctrines or all the right statements. I think it's when orthodoxy gets disconnected from our encounter with the living God that it just becomes something rote, routine, a dry and dense list of doctrines or whatever. If we're talking about getting to know the one who made us and the one who has saved us and sustains us, well, then it's different. What more thrilling subject could there be than God himself, who we will never fully understand in all of eternity because of his infinity? All of eternity, we will be growing in our knowledge and never coming to an end of the knowledge completely of who God is and how vast and amazing and immense he is.
When you're thinking on orthodoxy, we're contemplating this idea, which was a good illustration, by the way. Sun, well done. You mentioned how it looks narrow on the outside, but when you get in, it's actually broad. I thought you were going to drop an illustration of Doctor Who and the TARDIS, because that's what it is, right? It's this small little thing on the outside that you see, and you get inside and you're like, wow, this is much bigger than I anticipated. Most people that I encounter, though, they don't want to talk about orthodoxy because they don't believe that it's relevant to their everyday life. How do you show people that this is connected to their everyday life and it is much bigger and more grand and more wonderful than they ever anticipated. I mean, you've already
Yeah.
alluded to it somewhat, but
Yeah, I think the reason a lot of people think it's disconnected is because it seems like dry, arcane, theological disputes that don't necessarily connect to just, loving God, loving people, or whatever,
Mhm.
however we sum up the day-to-day Christian life. And I would be the first to say there are some aspects of theological precision and study and whatnot that really I don't think are necessary to fully grapple with in order to understand and to be able to live well the Christian life. I mean, there's a reason why certain pastors and theologians are called to be pastors and theologians. In part is because that task isn't necessarily, some of the deeper details of that task aren't necessary for everyone. But I would say that I think we have a culture we live in a culture right now that prioritizes whatever seems immediately practical over what would be seen as doctrinal, and not recognizing how doctrine informs and influences practice. So, yeah, you can say love God and love your neighbor, but you have to at least ask the question at some point, what does love mean? Like, what is love? You got to ask the question, who is my neighbor? Does the shape of Christian love look like for this particular neighbor in this particular circumstance? People say, oh, I just want to, all it's important is for me to follow Jesus and, live on mission and share the gospel. Okay. But at some point you've got to define, what is the gospel you're sharing? Who is the Jesus you're following? Jesus himself asks his disciples, who do you say that I am? In a sense, all Christian theology is an answer to that question. So, like, you've got, like, are you following a Jesus of popular cultural understanding? The Jesus of, just whatever your particular preferences may be. Are you making a Jesus in your own image? I mean, we see all of this taking place in society. So at some, and then the same thing with the mission. Like, well, what is the mission? What is it? Just evangelism? Is it also serving the poor? Is it serving the needy? Is it a broader mission, a more narrow mission? Like, all of these are questions that it directly impact our practice. And if you say you don't need to grapple with any of that, you just need to keep it simple and do the thing. Well, okay, but at some level, you are adopting a theology and a doctrine that that's all there, whether you recognize it is there or not.
Mm.
And so that's the challenge I think that we've got to hold together.
Well, not only that, in taking the faith that's been accepted for all time, contending for the faith, really what we're trying to do here, and showing the contours that have been established, especially early on. As new challenges come into the church, as you mentioned right now, anthropology is one of those. But as we also become much more global, we're encountering cultural viewpoints that many of those Orthodox statements probably did encounter, but for whatever reason didn't feel the need to articulate it. Like, I know, going to Africa or going to India, the questions that are most preeminent on a Westerner's mind are not preeminent on those in those other cultural contexts mind. How do we keep then orthodoxy firm, but yet, I don't want to say free, like you said, there's freedom within it, but understand that the lines that we have, or have been created for us, let's say, are still somewhat not nebulous, but they're, and I don't want to say expanding, but the contours perhaps are changing slightly as they're encountering viewpoints and other interactions. So how does that orthodoxy help shape us? How do we help our other brothers and sisters? Like, I had a church with many Africans in that, and a lot of the ways that we are articulating the faith meant nothing to them, just that their cultural didn't take it. Not that they weren't important. I'm firm agreement that orthodoxy is really the script, as Kevin talks about, that we perform in front of. But as I encountered their cultural worldviews, I found that much of the emphasis that I had on my theology was experientially not where they were. So how do we maintain these lines that are firm, trustworthy, secure, true, keeping us on the right path, and yet incorporating and moving? And there's an ebb and flow to that. How do we do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the good news is orthodoxy is really expansive. There's all sorts of room within orthodoxy for different cultural expressions of what that might look like and how that might be experienced or felt. And in fact, I think the encounter with other cultures and Christians in other cultures can lead us to a place where we recognize what's essential versus what's not, because you recognize this person believes the same things about Jesus, worships the same Jesus, is is seeking to follow Jesus, and yet their life looks different culturally than mine does, and it helps you understand. And they may have different views on any number of things. I mean, I did a post recently of why in certain places, like in Africa, for example, in a different context, getting a tattoo is seen as more egregious a sin than adultery. And the reason is because of the connection in that particular culture to being marked on the body with like particular ancient African practices and whatnot. And so it has this a complete different connotation, whereas adultery could be something to be forgiven and moved on. Like the mark is something that is, damaging long-term and whatnot.
Yeah, permanent.
And I'm not saying I'm not saying tattoos are sinful or that tattoos are worse than adultery. I'm simply saying when you ask, when it's one of those things that in encountering the church in other parts of the world, you suddenly recognize the way that they're thinking about and living out the faith may look different in particular circumstances, but that's because Orthodoxy is not an extraordinarily confining, constraining, only one culture kind of a thing. I mean, it's one of the main differences, I think, between Islam and Christianity here, that one of the reasons why Christianity has become the most, it's undeniable, the most diverse movement ever to exist on the planet when it comes to the amount of cultural expressions and different cultures that it has pervaded and influenced, and people from all over the world in different places and languages and whatnot. One of the reasons why that's the case is because Christianity is for all the world, and the orthodoxy that we adhere to, that we recognize as that bedrock of faith, it's so expansive when it comes to the expressions. So I don't think it's that our orthodoxy is adapting to those realities. I think our orthodoxy is better clarified and understood as to what's essential versus what's not when we come into contact with believers in other parts of the world.
So then well done, by the way. I wanted to sing, I had Stevie Wonder in my head, like "We Are the World" as you were going off there. I could hear the music underneath it. We are the world. That sounded so good. But how do you differ and how do you clarify? Help me out here. How do you clarify between Orthodox then and what would be like a secondary issue? You often hear the closed hand and open hand.
Right.
Where is that line for you, or where should it be for us? Because I find that these are very arbitrary and, again, somewhat culturally defined. I had a church that I was serving on staff with that got asked to adopt another church. And we came in and sat down, and they were passing out their constitution. And I laughed. First of all, I'm like, why are we getting their constitution? It seemed like this was a preliminary discussion, and this just seemed kind of a superfluous thing to do. And I had to laugh as I started reading over their doctrinal statement, because it was dealing with all the stuff from the 1950s when the church was incorporated, the World Council of Churches, just all of these different certain theological things, and really getting into the finer points of eschatology. With at this particular church, it was like pre-mill, pre-trib. They just got through this whole entire thing. But as the culture starts becoming much more pluralistic, I'm noticing that the walls within Christendom are starting to crumble in a good way. There's a good part to it because there's a unity that's being seen. But how do we uphold the Orthodox part of the essentials, as you say, when our brothers and sisters may have a different set of essentials that are much more arbitrary?
Okay, so I'm going to answer this question as a Protestant and as an evangelical, because obviously a Catholic or an Orthodox person is going to answer this question somewhat differently. And it's one of the challenges with, like, for example, this is an aside, but like Roman Catholicism post-Vatican II has been very open to the idea of separated brethren, ecclesial communities and whatnot, even though they want to maintain that the Roman Catholic Church is the only true church. But the challenge with Roman Catholicism is the amount of additional material they keep putting on to the deposit of faith. Like you gotta believe the bodily assumption of Mary and the Immaculate Conception, and the papal infallibility, and like it's just more and more over the centuries that like Orthodox people over here and Protestants are still like, like some of the stuff's not even in the Bible. Like it's not necessarily like, okay, believe what you want, but like don't like to say that this is like necessary to believe for salvation, which the Catholic Church sort of says, and on the one hand, and then doesn't on the other hand, because of the separated brethren and some of the outreach that they've done. So anyway, that's an aside. I'm answering this question as a Protestant, as an evangelical. Those secondary issues are very, very important for the structural integrity of the house you're living in. So instead of seeing Orthodoxy as that we're all living in one house, I think it would be better if we looked at Orthodoxy that we're all living in a neighborhood. And different denominations and traditions, faith traditions, are in different homes within that neighborhood. And there are times when, for evangelistic reasons, for political reasons, for whatever, we are all going to have a huge block party. We're going to all barbecue together. We're all going to be outside and we're going to enjoy, as C.S. Lewis talked about, like coming out of the rooms into the hallway. Occasionally, that's wonderful. It's fantastic. But at the end of the day, there are particular aspects that will matter as orthodoxy, small o orthodoxy, for your particular house. So, for example, if you're a Baptist, is it a secondary issue that you can agree with other believers in Christ as to whether or not the baptism of infants is the biblical command, or whether it's baptism of believers upon a profession of faith? That is an agree to disagree aspect within Christendom writ large. So Pentecostals and Assemblies of God and Church of God and even some Methodists, but Baptists and others will all be on one side of that, and then you have your Paedo-Baptists on the other side of that. There are debates going way back over this, so you can go back and find debates all the way back to Tertullian about baptism. So if you're in a Baptist house, is it a secondary issue? Well, in terms of the neighborhood, yes, because it doesn't keep you from visiting the Anglican house or visiting the Presbyterians down the street, or being able to receive gifts from the other faith traditions. But if someone were to come into your house and say, oh, you know what, it's not an essential doctrine of the faith, therefore you can take out this plank and we're just going to say, just be baptized however you want. It doesn't really matter in this house anymore. Well, for the Baptist house, that's a load-bearing wall. You remove the house, you're not a Baptist anymore. You remove the wall, you're not a Baptist anymore. Like at some level, you've become something else, but the structural integrity of the house is compromised at that level. So there's a sense in which different faith groups, based on how they read the Bible within the overarching neighborhood of orthodoxy, the overarching understanding, will come to see certain things as not essential for salvation, but essential for the integrity of the faith tradition that they're a part of. And at times they'll recognize that some things are not. So the Evangelical Free Church, for example, recently revised their doctrinal standard to not make premillennial views the only acceptable view within the E-Free Church. That had been a distinctive that they basically moved away from, to say the structural integrity of our house is fine if there's an agree to disagree within that home. But there are other denominations where if you were to make a move on a particular distinctive, you would compromise something of what makes the denomination distinctive, and could at the same time actually rob other Christians of the particular gifts that come from the structural integrity of that home. So again, I'm using the analogy of the neighborhood and the house, just so that you understand that at a second tier level, there are things that are not orthodoxy in the capital O, like big time orthodoxy sense, but still matter for like for Reformed orthodoxy or Baptist orthodoxy, or the different groups that we have. And I think it's important for us to be able to see those differences and recognize them in order to have a proper understanding of how this all fits.
Okay, I like the analogy. Not that I want to spend more time on the analogy, but I have found that oftentimes orthodoxy, while it is a big umbrella for people to go under, it's more of the cultural expression that the differences in structures of power come in on who determines what is true and what's not, and how we go about it, specifically within different ethnic groups. I mean, in the United States, I remember someone, I was reading an article, I can't remember which one it was, but it was talking about Martin Luther King Jr. And they when he was criticized for one of the schools that he attended, And they said, well, the problem was, or no, his theology. They were criticizing some of his theology. And they says, well, what did you expect? Because of the school that he attended, you wouldn't let him into that school, the school that you wanted him to go to determine that. So there is some of that aspect, that cultural part of it, and are really, I don't want to say really divided. I mean, from a media perspective, it seems that way. Let's put it that way. That Christianity right now, especially in the West, there's a great division. And we're seeing some denominations torn asunder because they have, I will go so far as remove themselves from Orthodoxy. How do we, though, give room to the cultural expressions that we see, especially when it comes to matters of ethnicity and understanding of interaction with the political sphere?
Yeah, I think this is a part of a bigger problem, and that's the conflation of um, particular political principles or particular political practices or prudence in the public realm.
How many
With,
P's can you do right there?
well, I guess you're right.
I was like, that's a preacher.
Proclamation, the propagation of the gospel. I mean, they're all coming to me now. So, no, but I think it's been, especially because we live in a more polarized area. We live in a more polarized era. No, this is one of the challenges we face right now, I think, in our society. And this is one of the things I mentioned in the book, I think, is that whenever we don't have in mind the sort of the epic stakes of what our choices are and how they matter for eternity, when it comes to salvation and damnation and what it means for us to be, saved, and why we have an evangelistic task before us. Whenever you lower the earthly stakes or the heavenly stakes, and you're no longer thinking really about people as saved and lost and wanting to reach people and whatnot, and that's evangelism takes a back seat. What happens is generally not that everyone is more tolerant and more inclusive and wonderful toward each other. What happens is that the earthly battles that are happening in Washington, D.C. or in Hollywood or in business or wherever you are, those wind up taking on the sort of epic eternal stakes. They wind up being raised in significance. So when you lower the eternal significance of our choices, you raise the earthly significance of our choices to where and I mean, people have been writing about this, even non-Christians are writing about this, that for some, politics has become something of a pseudo religion. Like it matters, but I mean, this is one of the shocking things I think to see more recently, is that for a majority, I can't remember the exact numbers, I've written about it somewhere, but there are more people in the United States today who would be upset if their son or daughter were to marry someone from the opposing political party than to marry someone from a different religion. It's just a shocking stat, because basically it means, like, I'd be better off if my daughter married a Hindu than a Republican, or a Democrat, no matter what you're. So this is one of those areas where you recognize, you can say, that means religion doesn't count for as much anymore. That's one takeaway from that. The other thing to take away from that is that no, politics has become the religion for people, so that you don't marry a heretic from the other party. And so I think because of that, it makes a lot of the conversations that we have much more heated than they need to be, particularly within the church. And I think there are lots of churches that get compromised very easily from an over politicization. And I think this happens actually on the left and the right. In fact, you're much more likely to hear politics in a church that leans left politically than you are in a church that leans right politically, even though that's not what you would hear from the media. If you actually look at the stats and the surveys, it's mainline denominations, for example, are way more likely to talk politics from the pulpit from a left centered point than people on the right. But it happens in both ways. And I'm not saying that it's always wrong, because I think there's a place for Christians need to be vocal and need to speak out on all kinds of issues. I think what makes it challenging is when we take what we consider to be prudence or wisdom in matters of politics, and our posture in politics, or how we engage, or how we seek to go about implementing what we see as a Christian influence perspective in society at some level, wanting to bring our values to bear on the political process, as we should. I think when we take some of those questions of the how to and the what and exactly, and we raise those to levels to level of orthodoxy, I think that's when we're in trouble, and we've got to be careful. I think that's when we're not taking seriously. And I see this happen. I see this happen constantly on both sides of the political aisle. The very people who, vote one way are their Christianity is called into question, same as people that vote another way, when there's all different things that people mean by a vote, and all different reasons why people vote the certain way they do. They don't all vote for the same reason or to support the same thing. So I just think we've got to take that down a notch or two, and let's say, let's focus on those areas of essential orthodoxy, no matter our ethnicity, that being first and foremost. And then we can have lots of conversations, even heated debate, over the best way forward when it comes to what does this look like in practice.
So when you have, I'm gonna give a book title that you're gonna hate, A Generous Orthodoxy.
I've read that book.
No, I know what you mean though, but because there is too far, you go too far, you drift into heresy. How do we then define heresy in our, like you mentioned orthodoxy, and you've defined it by the creeds, but there's a lot of stuff then that I would presume you would call heresy, being an Protestant evangelical Southern Baptist. How do we then, when is the proper way to call heresy a heresy? Or when do we do that?
Yeah. Well, I think we got to be careful with the H word, because I think people use heretics way too frequently. And so that you don't actually have the gravity of heresy when you really need it. Like, to be like, you know what I mean? Like when someone actually is a heretic, if everybody that disagrees with you is already a heretic, then you don't really have the gravity of that word. Heresy is when a fundamental truth of the gospel or Christian teaching is fundamentally denied, or so obscured as to be a functional denial of orthodoxy itself. So in between that are errors, and there's all kinds of errors. There are minimal errors, and there are errors that grow in their significance, and there are very significant errors that are not necessarily heresy, but extraordinarily damaging, right? So I don't think we want to just say, oh, well, there are heretics over here and the Orthodox over here, and all of us are in error in some way, so I guess we don't need to worry about errors. That's not the way it works. Yeah, we all are in error in some way, and the Lord will have to straighten us all out, because otherwise we'd all be in agreement. But we should be on guard against errors, because errors lead to heresy, and they can also take us over the cliff. There are positions, though, when you basically go against something that the church has always taught and believed and practiced, and has been basically the universal position of the church. The burden's on you to show how that's in line with orthodoxy, not the other way around. And so for example, today the big questions are over, sexuality and marriage. Like, can we agree to disagree on this? Can we just can we say it's an error or not, or whatnot? What you see in the denominations where that's being debated is it's fascinating, because 10 years ago, the revisionists were the ones who were saying, we just need to agree to disagree on this. This isn't in the creeds. It's not a gospel issue. Why can't we just be inclusive enough to include both perspectives in our denomination? Today, that's not what is seen. Today, it's the revisionists saying this is a gospel issue. If we're not inclusive, we're actually going against the fundamental teachings of Jesus. This is what it means for us to be a Christian in our society today and whatnot. We've got to repent of our past, and we have to change our position. So it's fascinating to see that shift in 10 years. But the burden of proof is on the revisionists, because they're actually taking a position that goes against the unchanging witness of the church. Until about 50 years ago, all churches everywhere, and even now, it's against the global church. So it's generally a shrinking subset of predominantly white Western liberal denominations that is jumping on this bandwagon, and the rest of the global church is saying, that this is not. So now you may ask the question, okay, is that a heresy? I would just take it one step below to say the presenting issue is the doctrine of marriage. the heresy that is there is not the change in position on marriage. It's the underlying anthropology that leads to that. So it's the question of humanity, what it means to be created in the image of God, male and female, good in his image, oriented toward a particular end. That is what the heresy is, a denial and obscurity and a fundamental distortion of that, which is the iceberg underneath the surface. So the denominations are wrecking on the iceberg of same-sex marriage, but same-sex marriage in itself is not the heresy as much as it's the expression of the anthropological heresy that's underneath, and which then connects to Christological heresies and other things. This is why on this particular issue itself, one of the ways you can tell a spot of heresy is that generally other parts of Christianity, other parts of Christian teaching begin to crumble. So it's why virtually almost everybody that jumps on and says, hey, I am completely Orthodox, I'm just going to tweak my understanding of marriage and sexuality, it doesn't work. Within 10, 15 years, I mean, I could name names right now, go down the list of people who are suddenly, then they're universalists, then they no longer believe in the atonement. Then they're suddenly, questioning the existence of God as a person altogether, the nature of calling God Father, and things like that. So you wind up like that particular thing that you think is not an essential. It shows itself to be a load-bearing wall in the house because of the way that the rest of the house crumbles after you remove it. So I think that's one of the ways. I think we got to be more careful in how we use the heretic word, but then we also have to recognize when heresy does its damage. Like you can watch it happen in real time, and then together with the global church and the church throughout history, say, bring additional clarification and definition to the question.
So then here's my next question, because you and I would be in complete agreement on orthodoxy. As a matter of fact, I think we'd share a lot of our theology just in our roots and background and expressing what I've read of you. I often struggle in our market-driven, I hate the term, but evangelical industrial complex, where Christian is just the term, whatever you self-identify. And then you get people, I mean, you and I remember J-Mac, not John MacArthur, but James MacDonald, and he did the Elephant Room, and he had T.D. Jakes in the Elephant Room, whose denial of the Trinity, or very heterodox view of the Trinity. And it brought a lot of people into question. Some people left, and it started kind of the crumbling of what was going down in the edifice. But in our cultural expression, when we have Christian magazines or websites or whatever, it's a self-identifying thing, and we throw up every single person who identifies as a Christian, no matter what their practice is, no matter what's going on. As soon as they say anything about God, we claim them. How do we respond to that? It's something that of our own creation. It's not like these are, I mean, let's hope not, it could be, but unbelievers running the show, and we're looking at this going, all right, how do I know who's in and who's not? I go to Africa. I mean, you travel around the world, you know just as well as I do. You go to a conference, you look outside, and there's Benny Hinn book. You just see it. You see the T.D. Jakes, you see the Joel Osteens. I would say that they fall out of the realm of orthodoxy, but yet so many Christians that I know, well, I know how you feel, but they tell it like it is. You hear that all the time. How do we respond in a loving way when even the media outlets that we go to favor these individuals and present them in front of our people day in and day out that they think they're okay?
Yeah. So I think we got to be really careful in when we talk about what constitutes heresy and orthodoxy. It's possible to be to be really off theologically and yet not actually fall under the particular definition of heresy. So for example, the oneness Pentecostal understanding that is basically modalism is a heresy. Completely is heretical. The question of whether T.D. Jakes affirms that or not is one that has been disputed and debated. And I haven't really studied this, but from what I've
on the spot.
Yeah, well, from what I've seen in this past, I think Jakes has come around to some kind of, to a Trinitarian affirmation at some level. And I hope he has, because obviously I'd rather him be teaching the truth rather than falsehood there. But the question, like when you go to Africa, you go to different places and you see people whose teaching is false in this way or that, or is, if not heretical, borderline. I think it takes a certain level of discipleship over time to be able to disciple people to a fuller understanding of Christianity, so that they see through some of that. I think there's a lot of American Christians that could read and I'm not saying Joel Osteen is a heretic, because I don't know that he's ever denied fundamental aspects of the faith, but you read like a Joel Osteen next to a John Piper, and like there are a lot of people that read both and I don't really recognize the vast difference. Like, I mean, like seriously, like you walk into some people's homes and you'll see both of them on the coffee table or something. And it's like
oil and water.
But I think we're assuming a certain level of understanding theologically that in a lot of places isn't there. So what do we do in that circumstance? Well, a couple of things. The good news is you're saved by the God of Orthodox doctrine, not by your understanding of Orthodox doctrine. You're saved by the God that Orthodox doctrine points to, not by your ability to articulate it perfectly. So again, now this is I'm talking about ordinary Christians here. I'm not talking about teachers of whom there is a higher standard who are teaching certain things. I'm talking about, the person who you see, you see the book on the coffee table and you kind of wonder what's going on.
You have a Trevin Wax book?
That's right. Yeah. They need my book on their coffee table. That's the whole point of the podcast. That's the whole point. No, so I think we have to be careful there, because it is possible to be in error. And I mean, this is one of the things that, that the reformers taught as well. They Richard Hooker, for example, the great Anglican theologian, made it very clear, as did Luther and Calvin and others, that a Christian can be wrong on their understanding of justification by faith alone, or on how they articulate the doctrine of justification by faith, and still be justified by faith in Christ. And the same is true. The same is true. Like I mentioned this in the book. Like I didn't realize that I had adopted the Apollinarian heresy in my understanding.
I read that.
Yeah, I had thought that Christ was a divine soul in a human body. It just makes sense to me. And then I come across it in a class where I realized that's one of the heresies. I thought, So, but I mean, but I was already saved before that. Like, again, I am saved by Jesus Christ, fully God and fully man, not because I am able to pass a test articulating exactly how he is fully God and fully man. That doesn't mean that heresy is unimportant. That doesn't mean we shouldn't seek to root it out, that we shouldn't teach against it, or that we shouldn't correct it when we find it. But I think we've got to recognize it's like there's a lot of what passes for Christian teaching in our day is just unhealthy junk food. And I think we got to help people to a better diet. And I think we do have to warn people when there's poison in the cabinet that'll kill them. So when you got someone that's actually walking down a path where they're beginning to read or to listen to, or to people that are actually dispensing poison because it's heretical teaching, I think that's when you have to do the warning. Some of the food that's out there is really bad for you. It's not poisonous, but it's going to be detrimental to your spiritual life. I think some of the prosperity gospel teachings and things like that some of them are heretical, like Kenneth Copeland and others, like but some are not necessarily heresy, and yet it's extraordinarily unsound, unhealthy teaching that is going to lead to unhealthy spirituality. So I think there's a place to warn against that as well, and to be able to say, look, this diet is going to leave you malnourished when you need sustenance, when suffering comes, or when this happens, or it's going to deform your view of God, things like that. So I think again, trying to keep things in proper categories. We want to keep people away from poison. We want to discourage people away from unhealthy foods, and we want to serve up the kind of feast and to make it tasty enough to where people recognize and they start to lose the appetite for the stuff that they've been the junk food they've been raiding from the pantry.
I want to go back for a moment, as you've brought out so many different aspects of different things, trying to define these contours of truth that have been there historically, or helping us to see them in a greater way and how they relate to the modern expressions that we encounter all the time. You start off the book with 4 people at a Christian conference, and you mention how they each one has the potential of drifting into or drifting away from orthodoxy. Can you just give a quick brief overview of those 4 positions and why you chose those 4?
Yeah, it seemed like those were 4 common ways I see that people start to drift. One is just the spiritual season of dryness or drought that can happen. I think it can happen either through sin or it can happen through suffering. And people can start to look for the jolt that they get from something that seems innovative or fresh teaching wise. So that's one way we drift. The other way is what way we've mentioned already in this podcast, just talking about how some people are just like, I just want whatever works. Just give me what's practical. I don't need to fool with theology. I don't need to really know theology, anything like that. That person can drift easily into a cult-like. It just would easily be taken in if people are doing the right things, it seems like, but are necessarily teaching something false, or can drift into just a pragmatic understanding of the Christian life, to where they start to see life as all about what they do rather than what Christ has done. So that's one way to drift. A third way, very popular today, I think, is just to always be unsettled and to be okay with being forever unsettled by some of the harder teachings of Christianity. Just sort of that vulnerable sense of, I just want to, I'm just wrestling through this and I really don't like this. I wish that, that the Bible taught something different, but this is what it teaches. I guess I got to go along with it, but I really did, would change it if I could. And so I think that sort of lack of, I think if that's where someone is, they need to be honest and authentic about where they are in that, but the goal is to work yourself out of that, to grow out of that, not to live in that forever. Because if you do, it's not going to be attractive to other people. And first of all, like, you're not going to, hey, come and be a Christian so you can be as unsettled in your faith as I am in mine. Like, I just don't know that really reaches people like people think, So I think we want to get to a place where our heart actually actually loves the truth, rather than just a sort of gritted teeth trying to hold on to whatever the truth teaches. And then the other way is just to replace Christianity with a cause, the cross with a cause. To be so involved in sort of the impact that Christianity is making on the world, that Christianity becomes instrumentalized, becomes an end, instead of becoming the end in itself, becomes a means to an end. Yeah.
Well, along with that, I mean, we've seen a lot of press over the last 5 to 10 years on dealing with issues of social justice, right? That's not a secret to anyone. And you go into the Old Testament and you see justice. You see this idea of justice that is brought out. I mean, you see it in different Old Testament books specifically. It seems that it's been more in the late 19th, early 20th century, where in the North American expression, because of the social gospel, became separated from many Orthodox, and I would say even orthopraxy, this idea where the two became bifurcated and they shouldn't have been. How do we help people restore this aspect of justice within the proper understanding of justice within an Orthodox umbrella? Or how do we get out of line? How do we get out of line? That might even be a better question.
Yeah,
which one you think is more profound?
This is way more than I know we're got to wrap up the conversation. This will take an hour.
This is going to be number 3, Trevin. That means you're going to be back again. We got to finish it up for number 3.
Yeah, no, that's a really difficult question, because it's interesting, because in the American context, some things have been bifurcated that were not bifurcated in other, either in our history or globally. If you go back to the sort of fundamentalist modernist controversies and things like the debate over the social gospel and whatnot. And so, so in the American context, it's there in predominantly white denominations, I would say, not necessarily all the American context, but in those denominations where the fundamentalist modernist controversies were largest, there was a divorce between what was seen as social actions, the social work of the church, the social influence of the church, and historic Christian teaching, orthodoxy, and whatnot. And that bifurcation is understandable historically, but also regrettable, because it's not been the full witness of evangelicalism going back, if you go back centuries. And it's also certainly not where the global church is. Look at, initial documents, for example, of the Lausanne Conference and whatnot, of just global evangelical Congress and whatnot. How is it that we get out of line here, or how do we differentiate between sort of biblical social justice or like social justice as, Basil the Great has a book called On Social Justice from like the 400s. So it's not like that term just appeared with Marx in the 1850s or whatnot, or in the last century. That's kind of our term that's been hijacked in some ways from secular ideologies that are materialist in their understanding of reality. They don't have a place for the transcendent, that they're reductionist, and that they reduce everything to economic, class, or in more recent cases like racial categories and whatnot. The challenge here on unpacking exactly how we are able to navigate those waters is difficult, because the church has been complicit in a lot of injustice through the years. So it's not as if the church is a pristine place where we can keep polluted waters from coming in. It's a place where polluted waters have been in. And so it's possible to that you're trying to prevent secular ideologies from coming in and wreaking havoc today, but you can only do that with, I think, some level of authority if you're also seeking to disinfect the water that you're in from the pollutions of racism that have been in the water for a long time, to the point that some people don't even recognize that they're there. So anyway, that's a very short beginning answer to a really long conversation we could have at some point.
Yes, we will have at some point. But I know we're running out of time here. We like to give people like their water bottle to sip on for the week. I mean, Apollos water. We want to water their faith and give something for them to hold on to. What's one little thought that they can hold on to this week as they're trying to water their faith?
I'd go back to I just think about the eagerness that Jude had when he was writing that letter that's at the very end of the Bible, where he said, dear brothers, I was eager to write to you about the salvation we share, but I felt concerned. And basically he feels concerned, and then he wants to write to urge them to contend for the faith once for all delivered to the saints. There's something about that eagerness, in that he really wanted to just talk about the gospel, but then he had to focus on these other issues. In all of the things that we do need to focus on, heresies, errors, challenges to the church, division, disunity, whatever it is that we may be facing, even challenges in our own life, we ought to want to have that eagerness that Jude had, to where that was why he sat down to write. He had to focus on the challenges, but it's because he loved the truth so much, and because he was eager to talk about that and to bask in that and to share that. I wonder, I feel like some people may be prone to different dangers here, but I wonder if some of the people that are most sort of engaged and vociferous and like, I'm going to root out all theological error no matter wherever I find it. I sometimes sense in that I've lost that I don't sense an eagerness and a thrill and a joy around the gospel. It's more of a combativeness that comes about from maybe just loving the fight more than loving the truth. I think there's something about that, even when we do have to contend for the faith, and we do. That's what Jude tells us to do. But he tells us that out of a heart that is eager to bask in the glory of salvation. And I think that's the heart posture we want to have. So if I were to, water the souls of people that are listening, do the heart check on yourself. When was the last time you were eager to worship, to adore the living God, to speak of his salvation to other people? Not eager to be in the fight, but eager about the truth that you're wanting to contend for. I think that's an important word for us, especially after a long conversation about orthodoxy doctrine.
Oh, well, I would agree. And I want to thank you for writing the book. I do recommend it to other people. And I want to thank you again for coming on Apollos Watered, brother.
Thanks so much. I will be super courageous if I do it a third time. So